Hey, welcome to Washington Policy Center on the Go, Washington Policy's Olympia Watch session. This is an ongoing series of events that we'll be having weekly. Every other week, we'll be on Facebook Live rather than the GoToMeeting format. So watch for us on Facebook, same time, same days, Tuesdays, but we'll be using the Facebook Live format every other week. And that'll be part of our Legislative Lunchbox Olympia Watch series with Chris Cargill, our Eastern Washington director. He'll be hosting that series, and he'll be with legislators from Olympia. There'll be opportunities for interaction, well, I should say in the 2021 remote session from Olympia or wherever they're holding their office at that day. But we'll have interaction with lawmakers talking about the legislative session and the bills that are most pressing and important to you. You'll see our full agenda coming up later in the program, so you'll be aware of what general topics we'll be covering on which dates, and I'd encourage you to register early so that you get reminders for that program. Today, it's an Olympia overview. The legislative session started yesterday, and we're going to be talking about what we expect to see in the upcoming session and just an overview, a bird's eye view of how we expect this legislative session to go. To talk about these things, we'll be speaking with our Vice President for Research, Paul Guppy of Washington Policy Center. Liv Finne, our Education Center Director, will be going last, right before the Q&A section. And Jason Mercier, our Center for Government Reform Director, will tackle budget and tax issues. So after we speak to the three members of WPC staff, then we'll have an open Q&A session. At any point, if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat function of the GoToMeeting toolbox there. Send me a question and we'll get to those at the end in about 25 minutes or so. We'll have a Q&A section and we'll go back and forth and we'll try and get to all the questions that you might have. Right now, to talk about kind of an overview of what's happening in Olympia, the 2021 legislative session, I'd like to bring forth Paul Guppy, our Vice President for Research. Paul, welcome, of course. So this is an unusual year, coming off an unusual year. It's a remote, a lot of remote qualities to the legislative session where people are being offered remote testimony. From the 10,000-foot view, how do you see this legislative session going and what should we watch for?
Well, that's a great question, and it's a strange mix of what Washington Policy Center expert researchers do every session, which is watching every move of the legislature, every committee hearing, every amendment, every roll call vote, with a completely unprecedented setup that the legislature is creating today. So this is again, unprecedented since Washington became a state in 1889. The legislature has met every year or every other year without fail in Olympia, in person, gathering in the chamber, meeting and debating with each other, holding official roll call votes. None of that is going to happen this year. So now they are doing this session entirely remotely. There are some members and leadership and staff are physically in Olympia, but many lawmakers are not there and they're not required to be there. And they will be conducting official business virtually. That includes committee hearings and committee testimony. So what our staff has done is adapted to those changes. Jason, who we'll be hearing from later on, is a leader on allowing citizens to participate by remote testimony. We've been arguing that for years to get open government. And now we're finding that the legislature has 100% adopted our recommendations and that people will be able to participate in committee hearings and make statements via video. So that's a positive development, but what we're watching for is just the standard work the legislature is doing. And then I'll close with the main area that we're concerned about, and that is the relentless push in Olympia to raise the tax burden. The governor has already proposed some new taxes, capital gains tax and other things in his proposed budget, which just came out a few days ago. And what we're pointing out is two obvious things. One is state revenue is expected to go up 7% without an increase in taxes, so that provides plenty of money. And then the other one is just the sort of offense and shock that most people hear, given the year that we just went through, to then hear that some of our state leaders and the governor want to add to our tax burden. That's a pretty astonishing move. So we will see how the legislature responds to that proposal.
Is that increase in expense basically hitting on all? I mean, we have what, 7 centers, 7 areas of focus of WPC research. Is this impacting all of them at this point?
Yes, it is. And so we've gotten questions about how is the restrictions affected Washington Policy Center's operations. And interestingly, it has caused us to adapt. We're very proud of our professional team, which has been very flexible, maintained tremendous professional enthusiasm about issues and energy all through the months that we've been going through this period and getting geared up for the legislative session, while at the same time adapting the way they do their work. So I oversee the research program. But as you know, Dave, we and many of our members know, our staff has been posting daily on our blog site with updates in all these different issues. And all 7 of our research centers are tracking their issues closely regarding legislation, amendments, new lawmakers coming in. We have our free website, washingtonvotes.org, is up and running. So in answer to your question, the answer is yes, it has affected our entire staff, but they have adapted and will be focusing intently on the issues just as they do every session. This time, the great bulk of our work is going to be done through the internet like we're doing right now.
You mentioned kind of a theme of the session was this, this reaction that despite state revenue being projected to increase by at least 7%, and that's on top of what the 20% increase of last time around. Jason can correct me there later if I'm wrong, but a growth of at least 7% revenue in the midst of what you've already described, a lot of unemployment, businesses under restriction, either going under or really struggling to survive, and yet there's this effort for increased revenue. Is that permeating through all of the areas of research that we have? I mean, is that something that's narrow in scope, or do you view it as kind of a broad-based approach that's happening right now in all kinds of areas of policy?
Yeah, it's broad-based. We're seeing it affect a number of research areas that we look at. So you touched on small businesses, joblessness and declining family income. So Mark Harmsworth, who runs our Small Business Center, has been focused on that. He is calling for B&O tax relief to give small businesses a break. Elizabeth Hugby, who is our researcher on labor and issues and jobs, is working to promote job opportunity. But this is all in response to what you just mentioned, and that is that surprisingly to everyone, and again, Jason tracks the revenue forecast very closely, last August, going into the fall, the state looked like it was facing a major fiscal crisis with budget shortfalls. By the time the legislature came to meet, which was yesterday, January 11th, but when they came into session, the revenue picture had turned incredibly rosy. And now the legislature is seeing amazing new revenue come in despite the lockdown in the economy. So that's positive for our public balance sheet. And again, all of our researchers are focusing on that to try to translate that into good policy ideas that help the people of our state. We're glad that lawmakers and the governor are not under the kind of fiscal pressure that they were a few months ago. We now want that same good news and positive attitude to flow out to every family, every business in the state, so that they can experience some financial relief as well.
Thanks, Paul. You'll be back for our Q&A section, but if you want to turn off your camera now, I'll bring forward Jason Mercier, our Center for Government Reform Director. Jason, Paul mentioned just a moment ago the advance of remote testimony. I know that's something that's been near and dear to your heart for what seems like forever to me, but it took a virus pandemic to finally get the message through. The Senate, to be fair, the Senate had adopted at least the majority of your recommendation on that score prior to this, but now the House is on board. Give us your thoughts on remote testimony and just tell us a little bit about how it's going to work.
Yeah, so as you mentioned, we've been working on this since at least 2013, made a lot of inroads with the Senate, and that was part of their process in select committees for the past couple of years. And then just a few years ago, the House did a little pilot project. But if the pandemic is going to throw you upside down, you got to take advantage of it. And thankfully now, every committee, every bill will have remote testimony, not from a fixed location, but right from your kitchen table or in your bedroom, like where I'm in right now. So it is very easy to do. I've already personally signed up for the capital gains income tax hearing this Thursday. And how you do this, both the House and the Senate have created standalone pages to sign up for remote testimony. And it's going to give you 3 options. It's going to allow you to do written testimony, either video or phone testimony, or you can just say that you want your position noted for the official record. And you don't have to choose. You can do one of them or all of them. And the key, though, is you've got to sign in at least an hour before the hearing starts. And if you do have any tech problems, you can still submit those written comments up to 24 hours after the hearing ends. So this is a historic session. You've got the COVID policies. You've got emergency powers reform. We have a bill that's been introduced, a bipartisan bill to tell the governor, thanks for what you've done, but we want to fully reopen the economy now. That is something that we'll want to comment on. So it's really important that we all take advantage of this opportunity to let our voice be heard.
Do you think that, I know that this is a pandemic emergency measure, the remote testimony, but is this the kind of thing that once they go in that direction, it's going to be difficult to go back?
Yeah, I'm really hoping this genie is fully out of the bottle. And in fact, yesterday morning on the House floor, the majority leader referenced the Policy Center's efforts for this and said, we're more transparent now. We have more access now. And that should remain the same transparency and access even after this pandemic ends. So it's really going to be up to us to show that we take advantage of it and we don't abuse it. But it's going to, once you provide citizens the ability to participate remotely, it's going to be really hard to take that away.
It's interesting, though, that same sentiment, if this has been going on, as you point out, for 7 years, and that argument's been made for 7 years, and only now is it sinking in that, hey, now it's greater transparency and better access. But I'm hopeful that it'll be a permanent reform. We should note that most of the every other Western state, there have been special sessions with the COVID pandemic emergencies. In Washington State, there's been no special session despite this pandemic having been going on almost a year now, and with huge sweeping proclamations from the governor. And this is the opportunity now for the legislature to assert their role, their institutional role, not a partisan role, but an institutional role in terms of governance. What is the response so far regarding the governor's emergency powers, and how is the legislature responding to that? What do you expect to see?
Yes, as you mentioned, when this pandemic first started, the governor put out a press release and announced he had created what was called the Western States COVID Pact, made up of Washington, Oregon, California, Denver, and Nevada. Something all those states have in common is they're run by Democratic governors. So this is basically a Democratic coalition of states. Every one of those states has had at least one special session last year, some multiple, to allow the legislative branch of government to actually do its job and engage in this policy debate, with one exception, the state of Washington. Bipartisan requests from lawmakers to do this, and the governor refused. So as a result, you have seen almost 10 bills proposed to put some type of sideboards on those emergency powers. Because regardless of whether or not you think every decision the governor has made has been correct, it's not the role of the executive branch, which is supposed to execute policy, to have indefinite power cutting out the legislative branch in these decisions. So bills to put sideboards on that, and actually there's been a couple of bills that we highlighted today on our blog at washingtonpolicy.org addressing some of the other concerns about not doing a special session. The fiscal power of lawmakers. They're the ones charged with appropriations, and they were cut out of spending billions of dollars of federal funds. And you also had the bill I mentioned from Senator Braun and Senator Mullet to immediately put the state into phase 2, reopening up the economy, allowing businesses to start meeting their own needs as well. And then again, some other proposals about how do you respond going forward if the legislature wants to hold a special session, because up till yesterday when they adopted their joint rules, they didn't even have a procedure in place for the House and the Senate to call themselves into a special session, even if they had wanted to.
It's amazing. One of the other big stories of this unprecedented legislative session is one that seems to resurrect itself on a near yearly basis, and that is the income tax. But this is a different year, as I talked about with Paul Guppy, our Vice President for Research. Here we are in the midst of a pandemic. There's been businesses really suffering. Many have closed, particularly in the restaurant field, but elsewhere as well. People holding on by their bootstraps to stay afloat under these COVID restrictions. a lot of unemployment. And as we pointed out, or I should say you've pointed out, and as we shared, the projected state revenue is expected to increase by at least 7%, and that's on top of a 20% increase in state spending in the previous biennium, if I'm saying that right. And yet there's numerous tax increases that are being talked about, including an income tax on capital gains. How realistic is the income tax on capital gains threat? Is this the year where Washington State finally gives up its competitive advantage of being income tax free?
How realistic is it? It is a top priority of the governor. It is a top priority of the Speaker of the House, and it's a top priority of the Senate Majority Leader. So the trifecta of the state's leadership all said it's a priority for them. Are the votes there? That's going to be the question that we're going to have to see this session. And this is where, again, this Thursday at 4 p.m., the Senate is holding a remote testimony public hearing on the governor's income tax proposal. So this is our chance all the way in and let our position be known on it. You mentioned the competitive advantage. This is something the State Department of Commerce actually has a website called Choose Washington, where they try to get people to move here and open their businesses here. And it says you should choose Washington because we don't have an income tax. You're going to be at a competitive advantage, something that we are renowned for across the country. And if you're asking yourself, well, what are you saying, Jason? The governor says it's an excise tax. The bill title says it's an excise tax. Well, the bill details say it's an income tax. The tax applies to the federal capital gains you report to the IRS for your income tax return, which is why, if this passes for the first time, you're going to be required to submit your federal income tax to the state of Washington to verify that tax is applied. So whether you ask the IRS or any state in the country, this is not a debate. It's an income tax, but they're doing this to set up a lawsuit to see if they can get the courts to change the rules of the game, because right now it takes a constitutional amendment and the voters are having none of that.
It's really stunning when you think about it. And how many times have the voters rejected income tax in Washington State?
Oh, just 10 times, 10 straight times, including 6 constitutional amendments. The voters have politely, by 60, 70% no votes, said no thanks.
And real quickly, one of the things that you've pointed out a number of times is that in Washington State, you could have an income tax right now, but it's limited. And the goal of the current proposals is to try to get rid of that limitation. Just describe that in a nutshell.
Yeah, so you can have underneath the state constitution and over 100 years of rulings from the state Supreme Court, a flat 1% income tax. And the reason for this, the reason Washington doesn't have an income tax right now is because our Constitution is the broadest definition of property. It says it's everything subject to ownership. And for nearly 100 years, the state Supreme Court has kind of said you own your income. If you own your income, it's property. So if you follow the property tax restrictions, you can do a flat 1% income tax. But that's obviously not the rule. They want the Oregon, California, New Jersey graduated income tax. That's what requires a constitutional amendment. And my favorite ruling from the state Supreme Court was just a one-page order in 1960 where it told lawmakers, stop asking us. We're not changing our minds. If you want to graduate an income tax, amend the Constitution.
That's harder to do, though. much harder to do. Better to have a court do it for you. Jason, thank you so much. We're going to include Jason, of course, in our Q&A section. So if you have a question for Jason, be sure to put it in the little toolbox, the chat function or the question function there at the GoToMeeting toolbox on the right-hand side of your screen. You can enter your question at any time regarding that. Now, I'd like to bring Liv Finne, our Center for Education Director, up on screen. Liv, welcome.
Thank you. It's terrific to be here.
You know, it's strange to say what's on the agenda for education in this legislative session when it feels like schools have been all but closed for the better part of a year. It feels like education's kind of, it's like drifted away in some ways. But how do you see this legislative session shaping up, and how do you see the legislature currently anyway responding to what has been a sustained closure of Washington schools?
It is ironic because, as you know, we spend over half of the state budget on K-12 education. It's about $17 billion a year, and the schools have been closed since March. And what I see coming down from the legislature are various initiatives to perhaps make it easier to open schools. There's a bill from Senator Braun to change the standard for COVID positivity and requires school districts at a certain level of COVID positivity to open. There's an effort I saw this morning to get teachers at first in line to receive the COVID vaccine. But what's most interesting to me is that, like Jason, the COVID pandemic has brought forward the need for giving parents options, which is, he's been calling for remote testimony. We've been calling for giving parents options to the traditional public school system that has shown itself to be rigid and inflexible and unable to respond to this pandemic. And parents have left in droves. And it's between 40 and 50,000 parents have withdrawn their children from the public schools, and many have gone to the limited number of online schools that we have. Many have gone to our charter schools. It's obvious that we need to give parents more options, but also we have to think about the damage that the closed schools has done to the education of each child. 1.1 million students in K-12 schools who academics are showing that the academic damage to their learning may be a hurt that lasts a lifetime. And so we have to think very seriously about how to fix that pandemic learning loss. And the system has been unable to educate children under a pandemic. You can't expect the system to then fix the damage done to every individual child because it's so varied. So we are hoping to see proposals to give some of all this money. I mean, there's so much money for education in the public schools. Some of the money directly to parents, $3,000 per student, so that families can hire private tutors to evaluate where their children are in their academic learning and get them caught up. And we're hoping to see a proposal to actually give parents scholarships to attend private school, $12,000 scholarships. That is what would really help improve the quality of education, catch kids up from the loss that they've suffered. I don't expect the high schools to open in Washington State this spring. There is huge opposition among the union for reopening the schools until everything is perfectly safe. And Washington is going to be in one of the last states to open because of the power of the union. So we have to really think about what to do to help families so that their children aren't hurt by this.
It's interesting. I don't think we're the only state like this. I think I might have sent you this story I saw regarding a teachers union head in Illinois who was arguing for keeping the schools closed because it was too dangerous. And she had shared on her social media page on the same day her shots of her vacation at some beach island resort.
That was revolting picture of her lying on the beach saying, "Don't open the schools up. I don't have to go back to work." And right now there's a big fight. The leadership of the schools in Chicago, which is the local mayor, elected with the help of the union, has declared that the schools must open, and the unions are saying no, they are not going to open. So there's a big fight brewing in those schools. I predict this will continue. It is not good for children. It is not good for families. Families have had to, you realize families have had to hire daycare, working families, emergency providers are having to take out of their savings the cost of daycare so their children can be in a safe place while they work. These are real costs, a real burden. I mean, just look at it, the big picture. In education, the group that has suffered the most, has taken the biggest hit from the pandemic closed schools, are families and children. And so why would we then impose the state income tax, they call it an excise tax, impose the state income tax to give the school system that has failed to deliver education to the children more money, which is exactly what it looks like will happen. The numbers are enormous. Dave, the state earlier in the COVID bailout bill received $216 million to help schools reopen. Now in the new COVID bill, it's $824 million. Right? The schools have saved about $600 million in just transportation costs and other large sums of money in heating and cleaning and custodial costs that they haven't had to incur during COVID. So why not just give a portion of that funding to families so they can do what they need so their children aren't hurt for the rest of their lives because they lost the 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th grade. I mean, essentially they're wiping clean all the requirements. They're going to erase high school graduation requirements. They're They've erased the last year's tests requirements, so we're not going to even know where the kids are. So it's a disaster. It's a disaster in terms of what families are getting in Washington. And I'm hoping the legislators will come forward and help these families, because
do you see any bipartisan movement in that regard toward, for example, your recommendation of a $3,000 per student scholarship, taking some of this money and giving it direct to parents so that they can, for the purpose of educational tools? Do you see bipartisan movement toward that, or is it still basically, kind of a partisan divide in terms of the educational approach?
Well, I'll have to answer your question, Dave, when the session is a little further along. I haven't seen the bill yet. I'm hoping that there will be bipartisan support. I'm seeing some encouraging movement on the charter school issue. You realize this is one of the things I'm looking for in this legislative session, is that the legislature extends the time frame for allowing new charter schools to open in Washington State. That time frame has now expired, and that's of course one option that parents ought to have, and we need to have more charter schools. They are more flexible, more nimble. Our charter school sector has actually done a better job delivering education to our students as a sector than the traditional public schools. So why wouldn't we expand them? So I'm seeing some bipartisan support. I saw the bill introduced to extend this date by 2 Democrats, which is very promising, because all the Republicans support charter school expansion and would support such a bill. So we'll see. That's a hopeful sign. And online. But one feature of this is giving charter schools equitable funding, because they need equal funding. They don't have equal funding. So a charter school student, a low-income minority student choosing a charter school is getting less money for his education than some other student in a traditional school. And also for online schools have a long waiting list now, of course, and they are also underfunded in Washington State. So if we're serious about giving parents options outside the traditional model, we need to equitably fund them. That's of course only fair.
You alluded to this earlier, and if there ever was a time for flexible schools, now is that time. I think everybody should be able to see it. But instead, currently, there's a lot of savings going on just by the nature of the school closures, and there isn't yet movement to try to direct that money. But there is movement to try to increase funding, and there's claims that say, hey, these closed schools actually require more funding and increased taxes. Tell us about that movement.
Well, yes, I mean the governor's budget includes $400 million. This is what part of what he uses. He claims he's hoping to spend $400 million in the schools for accelerated learning, and that's part of what he hopes to spend the new capital gains income tax on. And that, of course, just think about it. The system is not organized to provide instruction to each individual. And so lawmakers ought to look at that with extreme skepticism, because throwing $400 million at a system that spends $17 billion a year and say, accelerate the learning of every child in Washington will not make it happen. It will just be absorbed in the spending systems of these school districts, and it will not achieve the desired aim. Our long experience with increasing funding for the public schools, we've doubled school funding by the state in the last 8 years. We've doubled it. It's now at $16,000 per student from $10,000 per student just a few short years ago, and we're not showing increased learning outcomes. So you just can't wave a magic wand and say this money is going to educate Johnny and Mary down the street, especially when they've lost a whole year of instruction. And their schools, you see, it's like a train that goes, public education is like a train. It's on a time scale. It will go to certain stops. First grade is delivered in the fall of 2020 to Johnny in 2020. And if he doesn't get first grade in 2020, he will not get first grade in 2021 when he's back in school. He will get second grade, which means he will have lost all the learning he needed to be successful in the successive grade. And that's what we're going to see ripple out here if we don't do something to help families catch their kids up. And that's what I'm really concerned. I mean, this is a serious matter, and nobody's really talking about the hurt to the children and to the families, to the education that we're supposed to be supporting. So we'll see what happens in the legislative session. I know that the schools are concerned about having lost funding because they've lost so many of their customers. And, that seems like, and I know there'll be a push to restore that funding that they've lost, which would be a fallacious concept. I mean, you do not give Safeway stores, new funding for customers it's lost. That's the kind of idea that's going on here, that this is sort of a protected, privileged class. Anyone who works in public schools gets to stay employed during COVID and protected, and more money when COVID is over. It doesn't, it just doesn't pass rational basis. You don't reward a school system for losing its students. You think about how to serve the students better by giving their parents options and by funding those options equitably. And we've been strong supporters of school choice. That is the way to not only give parents options, but it's also the way to provide an incentive for the traditional schools to improve themselves. When they see their customers leave and the money that the students bring with them leave to another option, they will start thinking about how to make a better school system, because
Liv,
they're motivated that way.
Let me stop you right there, because we're getting short on time, and I want to make sure we have our full Q&A section.
Yes.
So while Paul and Jason are coming back to the screen, let me just remind people that when you hear about the big tax increases, when you hear about every state in the union describing the income tax on capital gains as a volatile kind of tax, describing it as an income tax, when you learn about the IRS describing the capital gains tax is an income tax, not an excise tax, that's the work of Jason Mercier at Washington Policy Center, and we can't do that work without you. So if you are appreciative of the information that you get, and that you yourself are going to use that information, by all means, become a member of Washington Policy Center, donate to Washington Policy Center, get your friends to participate with Washington Policy Center, and a membership is as low as $50. With that, you'll be a part of our, you'll receive our newsletter, which is just chock filled with the information that you need to know about state policy on a weekly basis during the legislative session. And you can check our website, of course, for free. Our research is published online, but I would ask you to get you and your friends to be involved with Washington Policy Center and become members and amplify the work and the research and the information provided by staff like Liv, like Jason, and like Paul here at Washington Policy Center. We'll have a link in the chat function there if you want to donate to our mission. It's right there on the chat screen. If you want to save that link or donate while you listen to the rest of this program, you're welcome to do so. And be sure to share it with a friend. There's a lot of people that you might know that feel the same way as you do, that are interested in this information, that might not be able to participate right now, but you can share that link with them later. Now let's get to some of the questions that are pouring in for our panelists here. Here's the first question. I'm really concerned about HB 2288. It's for healthcare in schools. Paul, maybe this is best addressed by you. Are you familiar with that bill and what it would do?
Yeah, I am, and maybe I'll just speak personally here as a parent. So yes, my wife and I are very familiar with the health clinics in schools. Also, I might as well just throw in that we saw the picture of the teacher, who was also a union executive herself, sitting poolside at a resort in Puerto Rico while our schools have been shut down for months, and we have 2 kids living in our house who are just struggling to keep their education on track. And then to see, a photograph like that was really shocking. So that also feeds into our long-term concern about the role of health clinics, they're called, in public schools. So no one has an objection to basic, a nurse who's on hand in case a child has a problem. My wife and I have also taken care of foster kids who tend to get scrapes and injuries and things like that. That is not a concern. What is a concern is displacing the direction of parents over their children's health care for more serious issues. And so that's why we track bills like that, is the creeping mission creep, you might call it, where public schools are consistently sort of step by step advancing into areas of personal family matters, particularly the relationship between parents and caregivers and children. And whenever the public schools expand their mission into an area that's not related to education, that's always it doesn't necessarily mean that it's bad by itself, but it is an area of concern where the public, who is being asked to fund these additional services in the public schools, have to ask whether it's undermining the family structure of our society that provides a loving environment for children. And so that actually has been a concern, as Liv knows, that's been going on for decades, where the bureaucracy of the school district keeps adding more and more services, they call it, and actually taking away the ability of parents to look after their own children.
It also strikes me that Liv is frequently writing about the number of failing schools that are failing to teach some of the core basics that are supposed to be the primary core purpose of our educational system, schools that are failing generationally, year after year, decade after decade. And whenever I hear about something like this, Paul, I'm always thinking of, if you haven't achieved your core mission, expanding that mission is, it's a nice distraction from the core mission, but you really need to focus on that first mission first, right?
Right.
I mean,
so the economist Milton Friedman pointed out this effect years ago, in which government seems to be the only entity in the world that gets rewarded for failure, receives more money for failure. And the example he gave was the famous failure of the Edsel automobile in the 1950s that the Ford Motor Company produced and lost tons of money on. And Edsel automobile is now a collector's item. At the time, it was a massive market failure. And what Milton Friedman said is that if the Edsel car had been produced by a government agency, we would all be driving them today. I mean, they would just continue to produce this losing idea, regardless of how much it cost. And so that's an effect that we have to watch out for with government agencies.
Well, there are, as Dave, as you referred, there are 44,000 students that are assigned to 116 failing schools in Washington state every year. And you never hear them being talked about. They just say, we need more money for the schools, but they're not held accountable for their failures. And so giving, and that's because they have a guaranteed income stream, a monopoly with no competition, and parents given few choices. So that is why the corrective really is to give a portion of the funding to the families so they can decide how to use the money for education. And I mean, it's like you say, that the top priority of the schools is to educate the children, and they're failing to educate many children. And it's a serious problem. And we shouldn't be expanding our mission to healthcare, to these other ideas just to hire more staff to the schools. But the problem is that the powerful interest groups have great sway in Olympia, and they call for more money and more staffing, more control, more power.
Well, you answered my follow-up question to you. So let's go to Jason. Jason, here's a question coming in. It says, how did the budget come back from the big deficit that you described early on with the COVID pandemic?
Nobody has experienced a recession like this where a governor shuts down a state's economy. So the economists had no idea what they were modeling. And that's why you saw back in the early spring, our budget outlook changed to a projection of a $9.5 billion shortfall. I mean, that's just a massive swing in revenue. And that's why you were hearing the discussion about, we got to remember the Great Recession. We can't repeat those mistakes. We can't do an austerity budget. And unfortunately, as the economic picture changed, the rhetoric hasn't. You're still hearing that from the legislative Democratic leadership and the governor. But as Paul mentioned, that $9.5 billion shortfall by the time the November revenue forecast was adopted now shows the budget, the current budget, which is a 20% increase in spending. That's almost like two budgets in one cycle, is balanced. And we're projecting 7% revenue growth for the next budget that lawmakers are writing. So you got a balanced budget that is based upon a 20% increase in spending, and you have 7% new revenue coming in. You've got billions in reserves. You have the very real prospect now with the Democratic trifecta at the federal level of additional federal funds coming to the state of Washington. Any discussion of tax increases is just totally unfounded, uncalled for, especially playing games to try to create an income tax.
Next question. Mine, as well as everyone in the catering industry that I know of, got their unemployment rates quadrupled or even up to 10 times higher than 2019 and 2020 for 2021. This is devastating. We're working with the Hospitality Association, but I imagine this is happening all over the state for small businesses affected seriously by COVID. What can be done? Paul, you want to start with that?
Yeah, what can be done is to speak out loudly. We completely understand the frustration of small business owners and employers like that one. And again, Mark Harmsworth on our staff works on this issue full time. And he is conveying a #1 issue to state officials, both the governor and at the Employment Security Department. And that is that small businesses and employers are overburdened as it is, given property taxes, B&O taxes, payroll taxes, and then now an increase in the unemployment tax. And that the legislature should listen to the suffering that is happening in the economic sector as people try to get back on their feet, and not kick in this automatic trust fund payroll increase. So that's what the questioner is seeing at the, where it's trickled down to the people is this mechanism that the Employment Security Department operates in Olympia, which is an unemployment trust fund. And they have this bookkeeping authority that when the trust fund goes down a certain amount, they can impose an automatic tax increase on people without, and that's what that questioner is seeing going into effect, without a debate in the legislature, without a vote, without anybody going on record. It's just automatic revenue to go into this trust fund, not taking into account the fact that hundreds of millions of dollars of Washington state employment security money went to Nigeria during the COVID crisis. So there was a massive internet scam that hit our state and other states, and that money just flowed out of the state, and it was partially recovered, but still, it was a horrendous crime that was perpetrated against our system. State officials missed that entirely, and we were victimized, basically. In addition to that, there's been tremendous unemployment. And so, as Mark Harmsworth has been doing, he's showing that the Employment Security Trust Fund is being paid out as benefits for people. But now the solution has been for state officials to turn around and tax employers just at the time when people are trying to get back to work. So what we are pointing out is, wait a minute, if school districts and practically and local governments and unions are all going to Olympia looking for a bailout payment from the general fund, and Washington State is receiving hundreds of millions of dollars in free federal money that they hadn't received before, okay? How about passing a one-sentence bill that says that the general fund will top up the Employment Security Trust Fund up to authorized levels without imposing a new payroll tax on everybody? To us, that is a simple and obvious solution, and we're going to continue to promote that.
Next question is for Liv. Liv, why can't there be a group effort or a coordinated effort throughout the state to either furlough teachers or reduce pay commensurate with the lack of production by the schools? Is there not any interest in canceling this school year and laying off the administration and teaching staff? That I can't see the next part, but it's the student learning has crashed and burned. Something needs to be done. Your thoughts on any of that as a whole?
Well, it's what people would do in a rational system that is responsive to the market and what the market has done. And the schools have not delivered. They're all admitting that the remote learning is a disaster, that there's been unprecedented number of D's and F's. Children are failing. Even the state superintendent's son is a high school student, is doing very badly. Everybody admits that it's not serving children well, but not one person is being furloughed. Not one person is being fired in the public schools because they're protected. They've created a system that protects them from that kind of reality, being delivered to them. You know, the companies that have been hurt by this pandemic that are in the free market have been hurt badly, and they are losing businesses, they're losing their savings for life, they are losing their jobs, and they're hurting badly. And if the state legislature is listening to what's happening to the people of Washington State, they'll be passing bills to help the people of Washington State who deliver so much money to prop up this public sector and these public schools that are so protected. It's just rank unfairness. You know, they protect themselves with contracts, and they have a monopoly. They have a guaranteed income stream, and that is why they perform so badly. And that is why it has failed so dramatically, the public schools. You should see the groups of parents that are upset and working and writing their school boards and their superintendents and the governor and the legislators, open up our schools. These are our schools, open them up. And there's lots of research showing that it's safe for at least the lower grades to open up right now. All the science shows that children are not transmitting the virus, that the CDC director called for opening up the schools. Fauci called for opening up the schools. There are schools in Texas, Florida, across the South that are all open, Nebraska, areas of the Midwest. There are hybrid schools all through the Northeast, and yet Washington schools are closed to in-person learning. And I don't see any bright light at the end of this horizon, unfortunately, this year.
Next question reads, Governor Inslee is considering new penalties for workers terminated for refusing to work because of alleged concerns about COVID. He wants to add a new $10,000 fine for discriminating against these workers. The fine would be in addition to reinstatement and back pay requirements under existing law. This could take employers out by the knees. What is WPC working on regarding this, or are you familiar with it?
Yeah, so I'll respond to that, because we're operating on a couple of different levels for one common sense solution, and that is open up the economy. And so, you know, with health and safety guidelines, we're entirely in favor of that. So we realize that there's been a health crisis going on. We know that new social distancing procedures and various ways that restaurants and other retail businesses operate. We understand that all that is needed, but we are well past the point when this panic shutdown across the board is needed. And the governor, just as Jason knows, because he follows this closely, the governor just extended his emergency orders for closing the economy for some indefinite point into the future. So our solution is to let people go back to work and let employers and workers, employees, just as in a healthy way throughout the economy and society, work out arrangements that work for them. I mentioned that because of the great support that we've received from our members across the state, thousands of members, Washington Policy Center has not laid off a single person, which is good because we're busier than ever. And so we have adapted and as an employer and made arrangements for our employees to work. We think the same flexibility should be available to all other employers and business owners, and that the governor should not be introducing yet another layer of punishing micromanagement on everybody in the state, in addition to the executive shutdown order that he issued last March 25th. Okay, so we've been operating under these restrictions for coming up on a year, and yet when inevitable complications occur, people lose jobs, people can't go to work, people can go to work under certain rules, the governor's response to that is to impose yet another mandate on everyone. So we think that would just make things worse, and we wish that the governor would show a little bit of and care for what everybody is going through, and maybe allow more freedom for employers and workers to figure out how to get back to work.
Jason, next question's for you. The income tax proposal, as you describe it, is being described as an excise tax by advocates. One, how do we know it's, well, how can they say it's an excise tax? And two, if it's targeted toward a small percent of top earners, Why do you say that it's a test case for expanding an income tax more broadly?
How can they call it an excise tax? I have been asking myself that question for 8 years because there is not any tax professional in the world that says taxing income is an excise tax. An excise tax is a transactional tax applied at point of sale on price or volume. Think the gas tax, liquor taxes, the real estate excise tax, those are transactional excise taxes. An income tax, prepare to have your mind blown, applies to income. Capital gains are income. And the text of the bill, even though they try to play a 3-definition shell game, if you go through all 3 definitions, the tax applies to the income reported to the IRS. So it's an income tax. Why is this a test case? Because I mentioned for nearly 100 years, the Supreme Court has said you own your income, and it falls underneath the property tax restrictions, which is 1% in uniformity. There is no doubt in my mind that a court will rule this an income. There's just no way to rule it an excise tax. But that's not the goal. And we know this through public records from lawmakers. Their goal is not to have a capital gains excise tax because it's just nobody has a standalone tax on that. It's too volatile. Yet California voters in 2014, at the direction of their Democratic governor, amend their constitution to take capital gains income off of balance sheet so it would stop wrecking their budget. Right? That's just bad policy. Nobody does this. But the court may say, well, yes, it's an income tax, but you know what? We don't think you own your income anymore. Therefore, you can have a graduated income tax across the board without a constitutional amendment. That's what this is about.
So let me jump in, Jason, and as a longtime analyst, I noticed that effect too of where a label is just put on a bill. And it reminds me of the story in Alice in Wonderland where Humpty Dumpty says, a word means exactly what I want it to mean, not more and not less. And when I saw that proposal that said excise tax, and it's obvious that it's an income tax, it just made me think of Alice in Wonderland. It's completely invented by the sponsors for the purpose of trying to push this idea.
And Dave, if we have one more second here, when I was doing my research on this, because I wanted to make sure I wasn't missing something. Maybe I missed something. So I physically called every revenue director across the country. My question so perplexed the comptroller of the state of Texas. She called me back with all of her fiscal staff to explain what I meant by that. And when I described the bill in Washington, the room erupted into laughter.
I mean, that's the thing that strikes me as someone with a media background, and somebody who's observed media habits. There's all these fact checks out there. And what shocks me is in Washington state, you have even Washington state, as you pointed out, our own commerce and departments have recognized, this is an income tax. Everything is about income taxes. The IRS recognizes it as an income tax. And yet, when you read about it, it's an excise tax, but critics say it's an income tax. And I can't imagine there's any other circumstance where you'd have all 49 other states, plus parts of Washington state government, plus our Washington state's own marketing plan, plus the Internal Revenue Service, above all, recognizing this as an income tax, and then allowing someone to get away with saying that it's not. It just blows my mind every time I think about it.
And even worse, when Texans are laughing at us, things are getting pretty bad.
And Dave, Paul may not have approved this blog title, but a couple of years ago, I actually had in my blog title, please fact check me, anybody.
Yes. Now, this next question is for Liv. Is there a website where we can see the total savings for schools? I take this means under COVID. I'm curious because this would be a great talking point with other people. If they have a huge surplus, it should go directly to students.
Yes, I had a blog recently. I wish I could remember the title, but I listed some of the top flight items. One of them is, so I will, if you would like to send me an email, I will send you to that blog post. My email address is lfsinfrank@washingtonpolicy.org, but I'll be writing some more blogs on that topic for sure. So just keep an eye on what we're producing now in the legislative session. You'll see it. But from the top of my mind, transportation, it's clear they are not transporting children to the schools. So That's a $600 million cost right there that they're not incurring.
I just put your email address in the chat function there for anybody who wants to grab it. Also, what we can do is at your center page from WashingtonPolicy.org, you go to the Center for Education. What we can do, Liv, is if you find that blog, we can put it up to the top and highlight it for a while so people can find it easily enough.
I'll send it later.
Or create a new blog based on that.
Yeah, she posted that. I mean, good work, Liv. She posted that just recently.
Yeah.
It's not like it's buried way back. It's only in the last few weeks.
Yeah, exactly. I'll bring your attention to it.
The next question, the new administration says they'll get rid of charter schools, period. Will that have an effect on what you're trying to do with expanding charter schools in this state? Liv, we're getting short on time, so maybe 30 seconds.
Certainly, it's discouraging to see that, but the success of charter schools is so stunning in our state that even the opponents can't ignore the benefits to students, especially with the new language of equity for low-income minority children. Real equity, they say, is access. So access to opportunities is obviously important, and charter schools is one such opportunity.
And Jason, one very quick question for you is the proposed capital gains tax, does it apply to gains from real estate in other states?
Off the top of my head, Dave, I don't know. They have a lot of exemptions. It is interesting, though, the bill does say you get a credit for the income tax you pay in other states.
Interesting. Okay, but I'm sure Jason will have a blog on that at some point coming up in the legislative session. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Jason. Thank you, Liv. If you valued the information that you found here today, and you value the information that the Washington Policy Center shares on a regular basis, we would encourage you to become a member of Washington Policy Center. On your screen, you'll shortly see the membership opportunities that are available. You can join Washington Policy Center for as low as $50 and become a member. That will make sure that you get the weekly newsletter, which you can also sign up for at WashingtonPolicy.org. Get our weekly newsletter, get updated on the latest state policy. And a lot of that information is the kind of information you need to know. And we have our center directors offer their expertise on their areas of research on a weekly basis, really even more often on a daily basis on their blog, but you'll have access to their professional publications. And I'd encourage you to take a look at the different ways you can become a member of Washington Policy Center and choose the one that works best for you. And make sure that if you have friends that are like-minded, concerned about the direction of Washington State, that are fans of the free market and would like to see more free market reforms, have them join Washington Policy Center as well and amplify their voice, amplify the voice and the reach of the research of Washington Policy Center staff so that we can maximize our impact in Washington State. I'd also like to remind you we have upcoming events every week dealing with the legislative session while it's in session. We'll continue this Olympia Watch series throughout the session. January 19th, next Tuesday, we'll have a Facebook Live event. That'll be hosted by Chris Cargill, our Eastern Washington director. He usually has those events this time we're calling them Washington Policy on the Go Legislative Lunchbox. Historically, legislative lunchbox sessions have been in-person, a breakfast session, but because of COVID restrictions, they're online and open to everybody. So that'll be coming up next Tuesday, same time, live via our Facebook page. So if you show up on our Facebook page next Tuesday at noon, you'll be able to watch that event. You'll be speaking with legislators and you'll have your opportunity to speak directly to them and ask questions and interact. And then coming up January 26th, we'll take a look at transportation policy and another Olympia Watch event, just like the one you watched today. We'll speak with our Cole Center for Transportation Director, Maria Frost, and we'll check with her about the likelihood of GPS trackers going into your car for a new mileage tax in Washington State, new proposed gas taxes, and changes in priorities for transportation. Whether or not, for example, mobility, individual mobility is still a goal of our State Department of Transportation. We'll talk to her about those things coming up on January 26th. I hope you register early for those events and remind some friends to do so as well. Thank you so much for watching this. The recording of this will be available on our YouTube channel. So if you saw something that you really liked, you can go to our YouTube channel in a couple of days and you'll see it there and you can share it with your friends as well. Thanks so much for viewing. Have a great day and be sure to join us next week.
Thank
Bye-bye,
you.
everybody.
Thank you.